So we're moving on to chapter 17, which is our first chapter in the cardiovascular system. And your cardiovascular system includes a pump, which in our case is our heart, right? Which creates pressure. And it creates pressure for fluid, which in this case is blood. And that pressure allows that fluid to move through a series of conducting tubes, which we call blood vessels. And so the next few chapters, we're going to be talking a lot about blood today, specifically that fluid, and the pump that produces the pressure and the vessels through which that fluid flows. Now that blood will flow away from the heart through a type of blood vessel called an artery. Then it will go to a type of vessel called a capillary, which allows for exchange. It's very small, thin-walled, allows for diffusion of gases and small particles. And then veins take blood back to the heart. So in terms of the definition of an artery and the definition of a vein, an artery takes blood away from the heart, a vein takes blood back to the heart, and capillaries are there for exchange in between. Now, blood has a lot of functions. But the primary function is transport, and it's transporting all kinds of things. It's essentially the interstate highway system of your body. It's transporting dissolved gases, so we tend to think of blood as transporting oxygen, which it does, to your tissues. It also transports CO2, which is a waste gas, away from your tissues and back towards your lungs. It also transports nutrients that it picks up in your intestines, where you absorb them, and drops them off at your tissues, and it picks up metabolic wastes, things like urea and nitrogenous wastes that you create at your tissues, and then those get filtered out of the kidneys for excretion. Within your blood, you also have buffer systems which help regulate your pH, and diffusion between your blood and your interstitial fluids allows you to regulate your ion composition somewhat, and it also allows you to sort of diffuse toxins and things like that throughout your body rather than having them accumulate in one place. And it allows you to restrict fluid loss at injury sites. You have a mechanism by which when you open up a blood vessel, it clots, right? You have a clotting system, and that's also a function of the blood. In addition to clotting, right, you've probably heard of white blood cells in the context of defense against invaders, right? Especially right now in a pandemic, white blood cells are pretty important. So we'll discuss most of that functionality in a couple of chapters, but defense against toxins and pathogens is an important function of blood, and stabilization of body temperature, right? Kind of distributing heat throughout the body. You may remember from Bio 151 that blood is in fact a connective tissue, right? We have those four main types of tissues. We have epithelial tissue and nervous tissue and muscular tissue and connective tissue. And blood, while it's much different from like dense regular connective tissue in your tendons or osseous tissue in your bones, it is a type of connective tissue, meaning it has cells and cell fragments and then a matrix. And the matrix is made of in other connective tissue, sometimes it's gelatinous or something like this. In blood, it's fluid, it's your plasma, and some protein fibers in that. Now, blood's different because those protein fibers aren't really fibers unless you need them to be. They're like pre-fiber proteins that can turn into fibers when you need to clot. But it's made of plasma and formed elements like cells and cell fragments. You have in the ballpark of 5 liters of blood in your body. If you're a larger person, you probably have more blood in your body. Males tend to have a little bit more blood than females. One reason for that is that females tend to have a higher ratio of lipids to muscle tissue. And that's because females may have to have enough stored energy to have offspring, right? To have a pregnancy, whereas males don't have to do that. And so because males tend to have a little bit more muscle relative to fat than females do, and muscle requires more oxygen, males need to have more blood. Now, again, that changes a little bit when you become pregnant. You need a lot more blood to deal with your placenta and the growing fetus. And so females will grow a lot more, produce a lot more blood during pregnancy. When you give blood and they just draw it from your body, either for tests or for Hawksworth, for somebody who needs blood at a hospital, they tend to call that whole blood. Whole blood is slightly alkaline, right? If neutral is exactly 7, blood is about 7.4, and it maintains a very tight pH range between 7.35 and 7.45. And it's 5 times more viscous, meaning like thicker in terms of slower flow than water is. And that viscosity is due to the stuff in it. So those are the formed elements like cells and cell fragments, and also proteins. Now, if you take that whole blood and you let it sit, or if you're in a hurry, if you spin it around in a centrifuge, it separates or fractionates into plasma on top, which will look a little yellowish, and your packed cell volume on the bottom. And that packed cell volume is almost entirely red blood cells, like 99%, but also some white blood cells and some platelets, and that is called your hematocrit, right? This packed cell volume is called hematocrit. If you want to give blood, they may measure your hematocrit to make sure it's high enough that you can spare some of these blood cells. But again, your hematocrit is almost entirely blood cells. White blood cells and platelets make up the rest, although in terms of just raw numbers, it's a relatively small amount. And then in the plasma, you have mostly water, right? 92% water. And then plasma proteins, which we'll talk about in a moment, albumins, globulins. You have globulins in your blood, and fibrinogen, and then lots of other solutes. Now, this is 1% of your plasma, but it's important. It includes all of your organic nutrients, like that glucose flowing around in your blood, all the organic wastes going to your kidneys, like your urea, and electrolytes, things like sodium and chloride, right? Those ions flowing around your blood. These things are very, very important, but they make up a relatively small amount of your blood plasma. Your blood plasma looks a lot like the interstitial fluid at your tissues, that is the fluid that your cells of your tissues are just kind of hanging out in. And the reason it looks a lot like that is because it's just exchanged back and forth, right? The fluid and a lot of the solutes are exchanged back and forth between your blood plasma and your tissue fluids, the interstitial fluid. The primary differences are going to be the levels of your respiratory gases. Your oxygen's going to tend to have more, your blood is going to tend to have more oxygen, right? Which is going to diffuse into your interstitial fluid. Your interstitial fluid is going to have more CO2 because that's being produced at your tissues, and that's going to diffuse back into the blood. So that's one of the major differences. The other one is the concentration of dissolved proteins. Proteins are too large to pass across those capillaries most of the time, and so the blood proteins that you have are not going to be diffusing back and forth between your blood and your interstitial fluid, and so the protein content is going to look a bit different. There are 3 main types of blood proteins. The first type is albumins, and that's the majority of all plasma proteins. These are produced in your liver, and they're very important for your plasma osmotic pressure. So the osmolarity of your blood, making sure it's the right concentration so that you don't have too much flow into the blood or out of the blood, is an important function of these plasma proteins called albumins. Globulins are most of the rest of the proteins, a little over a third. And there are transport globulins that can bind things that can't move through the blood on their own. Very often these are hormones that we talked about last time, like steroids, that are lipids, can't dissolve in blood. But you also have immunoglobulins, and these are sometimes called antibodies, and you're going to hear a lot about these in the news these days. Immunoglobulins are globular proteins, right? That has to do with the shape, right? And they attack particular pathogens. We'll talk a lot more about these when we get to the immune system. The third and final type of blood protein, which represents only about 4%, is fibrinogen. And fibrinogen, under the right circumstances, can become fibrin. And fibrin is a fibrous protein. So this is, again, back to the idea of blood as a connective tissue. When do we want those fibers? Well, we want those fibers when we have damage to a blood vessel and we want to clot. So it's very important that fibrinogen does not become fibrin when we don't want it to, because clotting at the wrong time can be very bad for health. But it's also very important that it does become fibrin when we need it to, so that we can stop bleeding. And we'll talk about that process a little bit later. So the fibrinogen is a protein that is a precursor to fibrin, which is a fibrous protein. Again, in addition to water and dissolved proteins, you also will find solutes, so things dissolved in the plasma like electrolytes, sodium being the biggest one, and potassium and calcium are big as well. Organic nutrients like amino acids and glucose, things like that, and also organic wastes like uric acid, things that will be taken out of your body at your kidneys. And this figure from your book is a nice summary of what you find in plasma. Your formed elements, or cells and cell fragments, are things that are too big to dissolve in the plasma, right? So these are different than proteins or electrolytes or nutrients. They include things like platelets, which are also important for clotting, white blood cells, which are important for defense, and again, the vast majority are red blood cells, 99.9% of the formed elements, and these are essential for oxygen transport in your blood. You have several different kinds of white blood cells, which we will talk about more momentarily. As you learned last year in Bio 151, blood is formed, or blood cells are formed, in the red bone marrow. And this process is called hemopoiesis, which means blood making, or sometimes called hematopoiesis, has the same meaning. And all of these blood cells, you have a lot of different types of blood cells, they all begin with a type of stem cell called a hematopoietic stem cell, or sometimes hemocytoblasts. And these are self-renewing. They're stem cells, so they're able to multiply. They're multipotent, which means they can become lots of different kinds of cells. Now, they're not totipotent, which are stem cells that can become any type of cell in your body, right? These can't become nerve cells and repair nerve damage or something like that, but they can become multiple different types of cells, specifically all of these types of blood cells. All hematopoietic stem cells, when they divide, will either remain hematopoietic stem cells and keep dividing, or they will become one of two other types of stem cells that can become a slightly smaller amount of cells. So if you think about it, as if you start on the top of a hill that's round and put a ball on the top, it could theoretically roll down in literally any direction 360 degrees around that whole hill. That would be a totipotent stem cell, right? When you are a zygote, you could become, that cell can become any type of cell in your body. But as soon as you start tipping down one side of the hill, still a lot of places you could wind up at the bottom, but you've eliminated sort of half the hill, right? You can no longer wind up down there. So hematopoietic stem cells still have a fairly large chunk of hill that they could wind up at the bottom of. And then lymphoid or myeloid stem cells essentially are a little bit further down the path, slightly fewer cells. So lymphoid stem cells can become lymphocytes, right? Myeloid stem cells can become any one of a number of other types of cells that we'll talk about in a bit. So again, lymphoid stem cells will become eventually a type of lymphocyte. And there are multiple types of lymphocytes, all of which come from lymphoid stem cells. And we'll discuss the difference between those types of lymphocytes later. But for now, just know that lymphoid stem cells go through this process and become lymphocytes. So while lymphoid stem cells will go through a process and become some type of lymphocyte, myeloid stem cells will go through any one of a few processes and will become any number of several different types of cells. So they could become one of these types of cells, which will come from a myeloblast or a monoblast. We'll talk about those in a second. Monoblast will eventually become a monocyte. They can go through a process that will turn them into a megakaryocyte. These are large cells which stick out these sort of pseudopods that crack off, and these cell fragments that result become platelets. So megakaryocytes make platelets. Or they can go through this process where they become a proerythroblast, which eventually will eject its nucleus and become a erythrocyte, red blood cell, right? Because red blood cells, oddly enough, do not have nuclei. So myeloid stem cells can result in erythrocytes, platelets, or any number of these white blood cells, basophils, eosinophils, neutrophils, and monocytes, just not lymphocytes.